Hello, everybody, and welcome into another episode here of Home Field Advantage. My name is Will Highland. I hope you're all having a great week or weekend, wherever and however you may be listening to this program across our great country or our great land. We are in the thick of April. We've talked at length over the last few weeks about the NHL and NBA playoffs, which we'll touch on as it pertains to our local clubs quickly at the end. We've talked about Major League Baseball and its updates with regard to rule changes. We've talked about the NFL draft last week. And so we've hit in the Masters the week before that. And we've talked with Michael about soccer and Diesel about all kinds of things. But today, I am going to have a little bit of a short show. Um, and mostly, if you're listening after Sunday afternoon, you will have found out the outcome of the Bruins game. You'll probably know about the Celtics outcome, and so I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about those two things. Where I do want to begin is with some pieces of news that happened over the weekend. And I very much like to stay current and talk about current events. But I also don't just want to regurgitate what you can find on ESPN or Bleacher Report or whatever throughout the course of a week. At the same time, though, there comes a time when, or there comes a point when the sports news is almost so complicated that it's actually easier for someone like myself to simply just read from an ESPN article. So that's what I'm going to do right here as it pertains to this lead story that I think a lot of you guys have heard of and might have strong opinions of. And that is that four NFL players from the Detroit Lions plus a player from the Washington Commanders were suspended this week for violating the league's gambling policy. And I have an opinion on this matter. It's an opinion that I've shared with Michael as recently as, 3 or 4 weeks ago. And it's an opinion that I think is still in a little bit of a minority among sports fans. And then that discussion will lead us into another current event that I'll get to before we move on and talk playoffs. So where I want to begin is with this ESPN story that I'll read from, in which four Detroit Lions players and one Washington Commander player were suspended. And this isn't the first time this has happened. If you remember, Calvin Ridley was suspended last season for an entire year, could not play for the Falcons all year long because he too violated the league's policy on gambling. I'll get to the irony of this in a moment, but I'll begin the show by simply reading from this ESPN article written by a man named Eric Woodyard. I don't know much about him, but I would suspect that he covers Detroit sports for ESPN. So I'll read from this. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm going to be looking away for a second. If you're listening on audio, you won't know the difference. So this is from Eric Woodyard. It was printed or I should say, published Friday afternoon. It says, quote, four Lions players, including 2022 first-round pick Jameson Williams, were among five players league-wide to be suspended for violating the NFL's gambling policy after an investigation by the league. Obviously, Jameson Williams is a pretty well-known player in college football, was a well-known player in college football, and similarly, a first-round draft pick by the Lions. Woodyard goes on to write, Lions wide receiver Quintez Cephas and safety C.J. Moore have been suspended indefinitely for betting on NFL games, as was Washington Commanders defensive end Shaka Toney. They can reapply for reinstatement after 1 year, although Detroit announced that its two players had been released. So it sounds like Quintez Cephas and C.J. Moore had been released. Second-year wide receivers Williams, that's Jameson Williams, and Stanley Berryhill are being suspended for 6 games each for mobile betting that occurred at the Lions Allen Park facility. These two did not bet on NFL games, the team said. The NFL noted in its announcement, I'm still reading from Woodyard's article, that it uncovered no evidence indicating any inside information was used or that any game was compromised by the players betting. The Lions became aware of the NFL's investigation about a month ago, before the league reached a final decision. As a result of the NFL investigation, it came to our attention that a few of our players had violated the league's gambling policy. This is a quote from the article in which they're quoting Detroit general manager Brad Holmes in a statement. Holmes went on to say, and Whittier quoted, "These players exhibited decision-making that is not consistent with our organizational values and violates league rules. We have made the decision to part ways with Quintez and CJ immediately. We are disappointed by the decision-making demonstrated by Stanley and Jameson, and will work with both players to ensure they understand the severity of these violations and have clarity on the league rules moving forward." Separate from these punishments, several Lions staff members in various departments were dismissed last month for violating the gambling policy as well, a source told ESPN. The Commanders also released a statement saying they had been made aware of the suspension of Shaka Toney. Their quote, I won't go into the rest of the article. Essentially, it's just a bunch of background about the statements and then, they're comparing it to the year-long suspension that Ridley received last year. So where do we go from here? Okay. I look at it two ways. First, actually, I'll look at it 3 ways. I'll break the second way down into, 2 different scopes. First thing that comes to mind here is, dude, you're at work, right? Like most of us, if you're listening, we have day jobs, right? We might go on Facebook at lunch or during break or when we get bored. I definitely go on Twitter to look at sports news periodically throughout the day. I mean, when I take a break or when I'm on lunch or whatever. I wouldn't personally think that your work is a place to do much more than that. Especially when it comes to something else that's making money for yourself, right? Like it would be an unethical work practice of me if I went to work and spent most of my workday doing work for another job or another thing that made me money. So just from a simple perspective, take gambling out of it, take the NFL out of it. If you went to your day job and you were getting paid by your employer, but yet you were doing something else that made money from somebody else, was paying you to work at work, if that makes sense, you are acting unethically, right? And you wouldn't go to your job, and let's say you were a copywriter, right? You wouldn't go to your job as a copywriter and while you were at work be writing copy for a competitor, right? You wouldn't go into work and try and make money doing a conflict of interest. And look, I mean, that's not to say we all go to work. We all sometimes might not be working the full time, right? But most of the time, we're not engaging in a sort of malpractice of our job duty, right? Like we're not. These guys are doing it at the team facility, right? They're at work gambling, right? So just take maybe my example of working for a competitor and throw that out, and maybe just say, if you're at work and you're gambling at work, just say that. Is that an ethical work practice? If you're on the clock and you duck out of work and go across the street to a casino, is that a fireable offense? Yes. If you're at work and you are, on your OnlyFans account, right? Is that a fireable offense? Yes. Um, so I think that's a little bit different than going on Facebook during your, lunch break or when your boss isn't looking, right? Especially if you're an NFL player. We've seen players get suspended for stupid things they do on social media. We've seen players get in hot water, get benched for saying stupid things while they're in front of their job, right? Wes Welker got benched for making jokes about Rex Ryan and his foot fetish, right? Antonio Brown practically got benched for taking a video in the locker room of Mike Tomlin speaking after a game. So in the same token, there's this just the very simple way of looking at it that these guys were doing something at work that they shouldn't have been doing. All right. That's number one. Number two is this is a natural byproduct of the hyper infused uh, sports gambling environment that we live in. Right? Think about it. We talked about this with Michael a couple weeks ago. You look around and all you see is advertisements for FanDuel, DraftKings, BetMGM, every single sports organization that I can think of in some way, shape, or form has a gambling component to or sports betting component to it right now. Nesson, the New England Sports Network, dropped their live sports highlight show because they didn't have enough resources to do it, supposedly. But suddenly, a few months later, they've got a live betting show. We have a extreme, I would say, inundation of sports gambling marketing in sports. And so what message do you think that sends, right? What message do you think that sends? You said, and the Lions said in their statement that it goes against their company philosophy or whatever, or their organizational values. Well, their organizational values, I guarantee in some way, shape, or form, that team is aligned somehow with a sports gambling company. Is that an organizational value when it makes you money at the corporate box office or whatever? Or is that organizational value only enforced when one of your players does something idiotic? Right? So that's a conversation that not a lot of people want to have in the sports world. Because guess what? There's a lot of money involved in this for everybody, for everyone, right? For the people like fans who participate, to the sponsors and advertisers and executives that negotiate these deals, to the companies that are able to get exposure through them. It is a huge moneymaker, and the NFL has made a deal with the devil. And so this is the natural byproduct of that deal. The third thing, and I think the one that I've heard that is a little bit interesting, and I heard Tom Curran from the Patriots. I say from the Patriots, from NBC Sports Boss, and he covers the Patriots. He talked about this on Friday afternoon. When you talk about having insider information, and it seems like that wasn't the case in some of these situations, but that has always been the decades-long argument against sports gambling, right? Is you think about all the way back to the Black Sox scandal or Pete Rose or Tim Donahue or anything like this. It's always been about competitive advantage and somebody using insider information, because we hate insider trading in the stock market, but yet most members of Congress still find a way to do it. I shouldn't say most. Certain members of Congress still find a way, to do it. Same thing in sports. That's one of the big question marks. But what Curran brought up is you are, as a reporter, privy to almost just as much insider information as anybody else. Like, let's say you're a beat reporter and you're in the locker room and you overhear something. You overhear let's say a basketball player talk about how he has a tweak in his hamstring or his quad or whatever, and he doesn't think he's going to play as much minutes the next night. That he's still going to start, but he's not going to play as many minutes. All right, you take that piece of information. It wasn't told to you on the record. Wasn't told to you in particular. You just overheard him say it to somebody else. You take that information and you're in the locker room. You're a member of the media. There's not rules about you gambling, to my knowledge. In many cases, a lot of these guys have podcasts like mine that I'm doing right now that are sponsored by sports betting companies. So they're just as much in bed with it as the players are and the teams are and the clubs are, but yet they don't have the rules. And in many ways, their employers are the ones negotiating these deals, especially if they work for a magazine or a TV company that relies a lot on advertising. So let's say you hear that information and this reporter goes and he learns, oh, the over-under for the amount of points that so-and-so is going to score the next night is going to be, let's say it's 16.5. But because you overheard in the locker room that he's not going to play as many minutes as he normally does, you would bet the under. Nobody else knows that he's might be dealing with a tweak. It's not in the official injury report because it's not serious enough, but it might cause him to only play, let's say 26 minutes in a game instead of 30. Then maybe you'd bet the under, and that would be an inside piece of information that you would be able to bring, right? And so that's the point that Curran brought up that I don't think a lot of people are talking about is this situation. They're fighting a war on three fronts right now. The first front is that, there's the work conflict. What are you doing at work? Should you be engaging in this at work, right? As a pro athlete, is it a conflict of interest? Much like a copywriter writing copy for another company while he's at work for a different one. Is it a conflict of interest for a pro athlete to gamble on sports? Number two, can we even call it a conflict of interest when the organizations themselves are in bed with these gambling companies? And number three, why are members of the sports media not held to a similar standard, given that they too, while not necessarily having the influence on the outcome of a game, they have information that they're privy to that maybe others aren't privy to. And so that's this mess that has been created by sports betting. And it's something that I don't think a lot of people saw as being a problem. And look, I feel this way. I'm not really a huge sports gambling guy. I think it's going to be detrimental to sports long term. I think there was a reason why it wasn't legal for a long time. From just a simple perspective. That being said, of course, states have the right to enact laws for or against it. Not debating that. I'm not debating that it does have economic benefit to certain parties. But I think an outcome of it is that you're going to have more situations like this. They're going to continue to happen. And sure, the NFL is going to be able to make a example out of guys like Jameson Williams and these other players. But the human nature is still not going to change. If you know that something's legal in the outer world, but your job might prohibit it, it, you're going to find ways around it, right? Like they're going to just have their friends do it for them, or their spouses do it for them, or they're going to have ways of getting around it, having burner phones, having burner accounts. I mean, that's what's going to happen because we've unleashed Pandora's box, and there's going to be some growing pains, and this is a growing pain. There's going to be these conflicts of interest that occur. For Pete's sake, no pun intended, Pete Rose isn't even in the Hall of Fame because of this, right? Just leave it at that. So anyway, that's my take. And guess what? When the other news that I'm going to talk about in a second, you can read it on the wall. The Oakland A's have found land to build a new stadium in Las Vegas. Why do you think all these teams are moving to Las Vegas? Why do you think Vegas got an NHL team before Seattle, even though Seattle was probably more deserving at the time of a team? Because these leagues want to get in bed with Vegas. Why do you think the Raiders moved to Vegas? Why do you think the NBA wants to go to Vegas? Now the Oakland Athletics are going to Vegas. The Chargers almost went to Vegas. It's a situation where sports has decided that the real customers are the gambling companies, the sponsors, the TV executives, and the TV media conglomerates, and not people like you and me. That's what they've decided. Now, look, I love sports still. Right? I'm gonna go watch the Bruins in a little bit. We got the Red Sox on. I'm gonna watch the Celtics maybe when they get to the next round, trying to take it one thing at a time. I haven't watched a lot of the Celtics. You guys know I'm a huge Pats guy. I watched March Madness. So like I still love sports. I love golf, watch the Premier League. But there is a time and a place where someday we are not going to be able to afford to go to anything but a minor league game. In fact, that's almost we're almost there now. We're almost there now. I mean, we talked about this with Michael a few weeks ago. The amount of disposable income that Americans have is declining each and every day with inflation. And it's already expensive enough to go to a pro sporting event. This gambling obsession that sports has with legalization of sports betting and getting in bed with these gambling companies, it's going to reach a fever pitch. There's going to be a moment where this bubble is going to burst. Look at cryptocurrency, right? That was something that everybody freaked out about for 5 or 6 years. And then it's sort of, in my opinion, become kind of irrelevant compared to what it was like in 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, those years when it was at its peak. It's a Trojan. Some of these things are a Trojan horse. There's going to be problems. NIL in college sports, I thought it was going to be awesome. It's created like an unrecognizable amount of transfers in the transfer portal and name, image, and likeness. Like it's like the wild, wild west. And in many ways, it's great because I had never seen more parity in college basketball or college football until this past year. Live golf, same way. I mean, there's all these new things breaking off as a result of the hyper amount of money that is involved in sports. And I just hope that we as fans don't get left in the dust, because you know who is getting left in the dust? People like the Oakland A's hardcore fans. I mean, the Oakland A's were a proud franchise. Say what you want about their ridiculous stadium. But look through that history of that team. Ricky Henderson, Mark McGuire, Jose Canseco, Dennis Eckersley, Raleigh Fingers, Catfish Hunter. I'm forgetting a big one there. I can't remember. You guys know where I'm going. This team was a staple, involved in some of the biggest games in the history of the sport. Right? Think of Kirk Gibson's home run, or the Bay Bridge World Series, or um, I believe they they were even a three-peat World Series champion in the 1970s. Let alone Moneyball in the 21st century. They made a whole movie about this team. This was a proud MLB team. With all due respect, this wasn't the Montreal Expos moving to Washington, or the Atlanta Thrashers going to Winnipeg, or anything else like we've seen, or the San Diego Chargers. This is a proud MLB team that has deep history across the country, in Philadelphia, in Kansas City. And the Oakland fans are being left behind, just like they were left behind by the Raiders. The Warriors went across the bridge once they became a dynasty. And what's it for? It's at the altar of money, right? So the fans in Oakland, they're getting left behind because nobody wants to fund the stadium, and the town doesn't really care, and they feel like the Oakland politicians feel like they have been brought around the bush by the Athletics, because the Athletics have just used them as leverage to go to Vegas all along. And why are they going to Vegas? Because of the money, because of the bed that they've made. And by they, I mean the sports industry folks have made with gambling companies and the casinos and all this stuff. Think about Bally Sports. All right, Barstool Sports. They sold out to Penn National Gaming. Bally Sports is a product of a gambling company. So, look, I know I'm showing a negative view of it, and I know this is an unpopular opinion, and you guys don't even have to agree with me. I actually welcome you to disagree with me, because it brings up good dialogue. But I'm just worried about this path that we're going down. Everyone hated the Super League in Europe when they were talking about that, because they thought, it was all about money. If you ask a fan, most fans agree, and they think, oh my gosh, I hate that sports is all about money and how expensive everything is. But then at the same time, we buy into it. We buy into it. We do fantasy football. We do sports betting. We do all these streaming services, the alphabet soup of whatever we need to do in order to watch these games, because we still love it. And I guess that's the push and pull that this is ultimately talking about. Or excuse me, that we're ultimately talking about. All right. So with regard to excuse me, with regard to expansion, okay. Let's say that Vegas we know about. Where else would the leagues expand? That would be good for fans, right? Not only just good for the pocketbook. We understand that. The bottom line, we get it. But where else would be good for the fans? And one thing that I think would be great for the Major League Baseball circuit in particular is if you had more teams in the Rocky Mountain West and more teams in the Southeast. So I'll start in the Rocky Mountain West. Salt Lake would be a great place for a team. Vegas, yes, despite what I've just said the last 30 minutes, would still be a good place for a baseball team, because between the 51s and the Aviators and all the other AAA teams that have been there, there is a desire for the sport there, much like there is in Salt Lake City, if you think about the Bees and all the other teams that have been there. So it's definitely a good baseball market. I look at four cities in particular. I look at two out west, and I look at two in the Southeast. So the two out west I've mentioned already. Salt Lake has a AAA franchise. Same thing with with Vegas. I think both of those cities would be good. I also think that they would benefit from having teams out there because of the departure of the A's from Oakland. Now, if the A's went from Oakland to Las Vegas, like they're looking at, then that's not really an expansion team. That's a team that's moving. But in reality, you would probably only see two expansion teams anyway because of the fact that there's already 30 teams and you wouldn't want more than 32. I think 32 is a prime amount because you can divide it in half all the way to one for playoff situations and for other things like that. I've also heard rumblings. A lot of people are talking about Omaha. I've heard some people talk about Portland, Oregon, Sacramento. I think Sacramento definitely has a AAA franchise. I'm not sure about Portland. Omaha has the Storm Chasers. So, and they have a beautiful ballpark already in TD Ameritrade that would just honestly need a few cosmetic upgrades to be big enough for Major League Baseball. And so that's what I see out west. So you'd probably add a team like that out west in one of those cities. Vancouver would be cool, but I just don't see them doing that. It'd probably be one of those four. And then here out east, a lot of people don't realize the Braves are like the only Major League Baseball team outside of Florida in the entire South. They are. I mean, the Cincinnati Reds are close. The St. Louis Cardinals are close. You do have the Nationals and the Orioles up in the DC Metroplex. But outside of that, there's the Braves and then there's the teams in Florida. And I think either Charlotte or Nashville would benefit greatly from having a Major League Baseball team. Charlotte, the Charlotte Knights were among the most attended AAA teams in the entire circuit of the International League and the Pacific Coast League a few years ago, and that hasn't gone away even after COVID. Same thing with the Nashville Sounds. They have a beautiful ballpark. Now, obviously, there would be some upgrades that would have to happen, or maybe even they would build a brand new park. Remains to be seen. A lot of people have brought up Orlando. Honestly, I don't think Florida needs another team. If you look at Florida, it's just not a baseball market for the major leagues, despite the amount of good baseball players that come from Florida and the amount of interest there is in the sport among its Hispanic American population. It's weird to see the national championship of the World Baseball Classic and how fervent that was that we talked about a couple months ago. And then compare it to a Marlins game where absolutely nobody gives a crap. So I don't see Orlando really being in the mix. It's really down nationwide. It's down to Portland. It's down to Salt Lake City, Vegas, potentially if the A's move there, which I think they will, based on the news this week. And then out east, it's down to Charlotte and Nashville. That's what I think would make the most sense. Montreal is a pipe dream, much like Quebec City is a pipe dream for the NHL. I feel like Montreal is a pipe dream for the MLB. Now, over in the NBA, it's a little interesting, right? I definitely think Vegas is a team. Vegas is getting a team in the NBA. But then you'd probably need to add another team to make it work. And here's what I would propose. I would propose that they give Canada a second team. Or that they put a team in a place like I'm losing my train of thought here. They put another team in the Midwest. Because if you think about Kansas and Nebraska and all those Midwest states and how much they love basketball, I would add an NBA team in Omaha or in Kansas City. Um, maybe even St. Louis if you could work that somehow. But I would add an NBA team in Kansas City, and I would add an NBA team in Vegas. That's what I would do if you wanted to keep it in America. There's also been talk about potentially, another team in the DC area if Baltimore got their team back or whatnot. But I would stick there in the middle of the country. I would also put a team in Seattle if you couldn't put one in Vancouver. Now, I just said that I would like to see Vancouver get a team in Major League Baseball. I think it's more likely that they would get an NBA team. However, at the same time, just from an arena perspective, they already have where the Canucks play. But from an arena perspective, it's probably better for the NBA to put a team in Seattle. The Kraken just went there, and in Seattle, the Sonics were a really hot ticket back in the day and have had some great players in their history. So really, you're looking at Vegas, you're looking at Kansas City, you're looking at maybe a place like Omaha, you're looking at Vancouver, Seattle. Um, Theoretically, a Seattle team would draw fans from Vancouver as well, basketball fans from British Columbia. So that's what I see in the landscape of expansion teams. But again, it's hard to look at all this stuff from just one guy sitting in a room in Maine. Um, but I'd be curious to hear what you guys all think. Maybe I'll drop it out on Instagram in a post for you guys all to participate in. All right, moving on. Lastly, want to do a quick Celtics and Bruins check-in before we wrap up the pod here. Celtics news sense is they won their first two games against the Hawks. They were able to really quiet down Atlanta. Trae Young and company did not have firepower in the first two games to take care of the Celtics. However, in game three, they did. And this comes off the news that Malcolm Brogdon won Sixth Man of the Year for the Celtics. And look, I still think the Celtics are going to win this series. I think they'll probably even win it in five. I think maybe that was a wake-up call they needed, much like the Bruins needed a wake-up call in game two against the Panthers. We'll get to that in a second. But I think the Celtics are still playing pretty well, even though game three didn't go well for them. I think they'll be able to shake it off. My one concern with the Celtics is they have been streaky all season. Their wins, they've been able to string together a lot of wins, but their losses, sometimes they'll randomly just lose two in a row. And if you lose two in a row, then you got a game five in Atlanta still. Right. And so that's what scares me a little bit. Things could go wrong here down there. And if you're a Celtics fan, I would look at your usual suspects. You're likely going to get a good game from Jason Tatum or Jaylen Brown again in this series. Probably one of them is going to have a monster game before it's all said and done. Similarly, I think you're going to get a game where a guy like Grant Williams or Peyton Pritchard just freaks out. I mean that's what's happened. If you look at the Celtics playoff run last year, it was, yep, we know that the Jays are going to play well. We know that Smart is going to play well. But maybe Time Lord will freak out and have a great game with a lot of rebounds. Maybe Pritchard or Grant Williams or oh gosh, this my lack of Celtics knowledge is escaping me. I can picture the guy, but I can't think of his name. Derek White, excuse me. Thank you. Derek White. Maybe one of these guys will just have a big game because that's typically what happens for the Celtics in the playoffs. Even years and years past. I remember that series against the Wizards, 5 or 6 years ago, and Terry Rozier just freaked out. Had an amazing game. And then when we were kids, it was the James Posey game or the Eddie House game. I mean, so that's what happens with the Celtics in the playoffs. And so I would expect that you're definitely going to get big games out of your big stars. And I think game 4 will be a big boy test, right? Like how is this team, how is Missoula, how do they battle adversity in the playoffs? And so that's what I'd like to see happen. All right. Bruins. Game one, I thought they beat the crap out of the Panthers physically. But I still thought the Panthers had a really, really good game and still had a chance to win. But I thought if the Bruins play that way, which is pretty good, pretty physical, but not their best, and they're still able to win 3-1, then they shouldn't have a problem winning the series. Then game two happened, and they got absolutely pantsed. And I thought, okay, so Lions was able to rebound because he had a bad game in net for the Panthers in game one. Thought, okay. Then the Bruins looked horrible in the neutral zone in game two. Turned the puck over every time they had it. Krejci looked slow. They've been playing without Bergeron, who's not expected back for game five. And you thought, oh my goodness, what are we gonna do? There's a little bit of panic going about. I was on pins and needles for game three, knowing that Bergeron wasn't playing. The lineup looked out of whack. And then at puck drop, we realized that Krejci wasn't going to be playing either. And so you're like, okay, now you're down two centermen. You got Foligno playing center. You got Frederick playing center. You got Nosek and Coyle. Zaka, what are we going to do? Then they played in game three, and they absolutely dominated the Panthers in the first and second period, and for most of the third period. Until, of course, the last 5 minutes of the game where they almost burped up the lead. And so I guess this is the long way of saying is this series has been a roller coaster. The Panthers definitely have belief, especially getting Sam Bennett back in game two. I think that made all the difference for them offensively. For the Bruins, you almost get this sense that the game has to start well for them or else they're going to get some sort of doubt, right? Like the game didn't start well for them in game two. And there's sort of this doubt that crept in and maybe this belief that there was a lot of pressure on them or that maybe they could just pull it out of their ass in the third period. And that wasn't able to happen. They had a lot of turnovers. Then in game three, they got up 4-0. And then there was this human nature aspect of, oh, well, we can close the game out. Next thing you know, it's 4-2. And they're really just lucky to escape out of that without having to go to overtime. And so I get this sense that the series is such a roller coaster that if you're a Bruins fan, what do we expect today? Now, obviously, if you're watching after today or listening after today, you know how this outcome goes. But to be quite frank, I don't know what to expect. Can this lineup work again for a second consecutive game? Where we don't have Krejci and we don't have Bergeron again that I know of. Definitely not Bergeron. So what do we expect as we head toward, puck drop? Is Taylor Hall going to have another strong game? Is Charlie Coyle going to have another strong game? How's Bertuzzi going to look? What are the turnovers going to look like? Who's going to be paired up with whom on D? I think there's a lot of questions. I think if they can get Bergeron back, it's almost like the nectar of the gods. Right? Like it could heal a lot of the questions that we have about this team right now in the first part of the series. I still think the Bruins win this series. I think they win it in 6. I would not be surprised if they lose today, win in game 5, and then go back to Florida and take care of business in game 6. I think that was my prediction at the beginning of the series, so I think that's what I'm going to stick with. So time will tell. Obviously, if you're listening after the fact, you'll know. But I hope you enjoyed this episode. It was quicker than normal. I rifled through a lot of topics. You guys may or may not agree with me about sports gambling, but that's fine. I'd love to hear what you think about the expansion franchises in both the NBA and Major League Baseball. And if neither the Bruins game today or the Celtics game in game 4 goes well, then maybe we can have some fan therapy about those as well. So that's going to do it for this episode of Home Field Advantage. We'll be back next week. I plan on talking some Red Sox. We'll see where they're at in another week. Chris Sale had a great outing this week, which is great considering I heard that he was too old and he sucks and he can't stay on the field. So that's great. The Red Sox seem to be treading water, so I plan on talking about them next week. I'll actually have a chance to see them up close in person next week. So that's where I'll begin. And then who knows? We'll know the outcome probably of both the Bruins and the Celtics series by then. So we'll probably digest a little bit of that too. But until next time, I hope you guys all have a great rest of your week. Please follow us online on our socials at Homefield Pod on Instagram and Twitter, and drop below and subscribe to us here on YouTube as well as via audio wherever you get your podcasts. Well, after you do all that, I hope you have a great rest of your week. You've been listening to the newest episode of Home Field Advantage.